So welcome to today's presentation. Our topic today is driving innovation from within a city. And this is the first presentation of our City Innovators speaker series. My name is John Joseph. I'm acting as your host today. I am very excited to introduce today's speakers, Nigel Jacob and Chris Davis. Nigel joins us from the Boston's Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. He is actually the co-founder of that office, and which is a civic innovation incubator and R&D lab from within the city of Boston. Nigel's work is about making urban life better via innovative, people-oriented applications of technology and design. And prior to joining the city of Boston, which he did in 2006, he worked in a series of technology startups in the Boston area. So he is a expert on technology and driving innovation within a city. And Chris Davis, who you probably know from some of our other presentations, is our VP of Strategic Partnerships and Smart Cities. He works here at Simcon Lighting with us, and he brings an extensive background in smart cities and innovations that are taking place all over the world. So Chris will be leading the discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris right now. And again, thank you for joining, and please enter questions as they come up. Chris, you there?
Yeah, I sure am, John. I like to apologize to people. I'm in a semi-public place, so hopefully there's not too much background noise. I got tied up in traffic, and so found a quiet place in a hospital, actually. So I'd like to introduce Nigel. Nigel and I have crossed paths a number of times, and he's a great and experienced smart city practitioner. So Nigel, if you're ready, we'll just get right into the interview. As many of us from Boston know, former and beloved Mayor Thomas Menino was known as the urban mechanic, and his forward-thinking manner led the city of Boston to create an Office of Innovation, which is now called the Office of New Urban Mechanics. So Nigel, can you provide the listeners with sort of the history of the office, how it got founded, its original mission, and how that's evolved over time?
You bet. And thanks again for having me on. It's going to be a fun conversation. So the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics was founded in 2010 or thereabouts, when Mayor Menino was running for his last term in office. He's Boston's longest serving mayor. He was in office for 20 years by the end of his run. And the thinking was by himself and his chief of staff, Mitch Weiss, that, Mayor Menino had demonstrated that a very people-oriented approach to running a local government, which was generally called the urban mechanics ethos, can be very effective. And so that it generated a lot of positive political and social capital. And so the mayor and Mitch's idea was to essentially figure out a way to capitalize on that, right? So prior to doing this work, I had been doing, I was in grad school, I was doing my PhD in computer science, and I was working with the city on a fellowship, essentially, where we were running a fellowship whose the target was to get people in academia working in local government. And so I had done, I think, some unusual projects for the city, at least at that time. We were partnering with like game development companies and different ideas in order to facilitate a different kind of civic dialogue. And I think that was one of the starting points in terms of content. And so, my sense is when the mayor got into office, he asked myself and Chris Osgood, one of my collaborators, who were already, both of us were already working at the city at the time, to lead this new office. The thought was to take his urban mechanics ethos to the next level through collaborations with the innovation ecosystem. So with startups and social entrepreneurs and university people and everyone in between and beyond. And so we've been doing that for about a decade. As far as we can tell, we were the first office of this sort to be founded within local government. We report directly to the new mayor. Mayor Walsh came to office in 2014, and there were some interesting moments when he took control of the reins here. He said, I remember sitting down with him, and he said, I don't know who you guys are or what a new urban mechanic is, but I'm going to give you some runway to prove yourselves. And so that was about 7 years ago. So I think the approach works, and we've, one of our biggest sort of institutional points of pride is that we've been able to withstand mayoral change. And so the mission of urban mechanics essentially stays the same, a people-oriented approach to innovation.
So Nigel, that's quite interesting. Can you give us a little more background on sort of the mission as it's viewed, let's say when it was started, and the office today? Just how has that
Sure.
evolved over time?
Yeah, one of the things about the team is there are a few important tenets as we've seen it, right? So, from the earliest stage, we always saw a key enabler to getting this work done as being autonomy, right? So I think that the idea that the mayor, certainly, I mean, we work for him, so he can certainly ask us to do things, but the thought that we're creating a separate team within local government that has not his own agenda, but a different but related agenda to his own, I think has always been a big part of this idea of why urban mechanics was worth pursuing. And in the early days when there was just two of us, we talked about ourselves as though we were a startup inside of local government, because that made sense, a team of two. But as the team has grown over the years, our capacity has grown, and skills in the team have grown. And so we've been able to take on bigger and a broader range of projects. But I would say the central idea of creating an autonomous team embedded in local government that is empowered to take risks and to essentially take on risk it remains very much at the heart of what we do. The thinking here is that one of the stumbling blocks for innovation or creativity, whatever euphemism you want to use, in local government has been their complete lack of tolerance for failure or risk. And so the idea was that by creating this small team, with a variety of different skills and different approaches, we could serve as a laboratory for those other agencies that want to try or explore new ideas, but don't want necessarily to have their names attached to these projects, or maybe that if these projects fail or these kind of explorations go nowhere, they may not want to have their name attached to that. And so instead, supposing that we want to explore some new ideas in transportation, right? There's lots of new ideas in transportation nowadays. The transportation department may not want to have their name or their budget attached to, some, exploring the latest and greatest ideas regarding what have you. And so they can engage with us, and we can try to figure out a project that is useful in maybe it's scooters or autonomous vehicles or what have you. And we can take on the risk and the potential failure of running that project. And so the logic here is that if the project itself doesn't work, if it fails in some way, then the people over at the transportation department don't end up with egg on their face, right? That we absorb all of the risk. We often call this function risk aggregation. So we aggregate the risk from these other departments to us because they can't fail. But our mission is to be able to be a place where risks can be undertaken and where failure is absolutely an option.
All right, that's quite interesting. That was the dimension of the office that I wasn't aware of. I know some of your team members and your colleagues; they're pretty talented. So, can you maybe describe the sets of experience and talent you have in the office, and how does that talent relate to the mission? And first of all, how do you attract them, given the Boston job market is frothy, right? It's hot, and I'm sure they could, knowing some of them, I'm sure they could make a lot more money in the private sector. So if you could maybe elaborate on that, that would be great.
Sure. So one of the things that we've seen over certainly the last 6 years is that there's a lot of people out there that want to work on social change efforts in one way or another. And, local government certainly is not the only place to do it, but it is one place. And so, we began to observe that we were getting, a different caliber of applicant into City Hall, and with very wider range of skills, certainly with the rise of like smart cities and these other sort of approaches to driving change in local government. And so we created a fellowship, or extended a fellowship, where the thought was that we could give people a taste of doing this work, and then where possible, we would try to hire them. And so the way that we think about hiring in general on the team is that the work of doing this sort of innovative approach to working within government is difficult, right? And so that means we need people that are comfortable working within a bureaucracy, right? So that's number one, right? Are you comfortable working in a hierarchical organization? At the same time, we need people that can also bring a can-do creative spirit to the work, right? So it's a little bit paradoxical, right? On the one hand, you have to be able to handle the bureaucratic nature of the place, but you also have to be able to bring your entrepreneurial spirit to the work. So as you can imagine, there aren't a lot of those people. I mean, there's a fair number, but whenever we find people with that kind of spirit, people that are interested in taking on these kinds of challenges, we do our best to hire them, right? And what we often find is that the people with these kind of proclivities often bring a very dynamic range of skills to the work, right? So as a result, we have filmmakers, and we have engineers and teachers and firemen and lawyers on the team. And as such, we've realized that there's it's more effective for us to hire generalists than specialists, right? Because specialists we can always do contract work with, right? And there's lots of those kind of folk. But for these sort of generalists, people that are creative public entrepreneurs, we try to do our best to create these jobs and these positions where these people will be interested in working. And it's kind of on us to make sure that we are curating the team in an effective way. In a lot of ways, the team is, sometimes I call them a stable of unicorns, but they have an incredible range of skills and abilities. And they, one of the things that we realized early on is that if we are, it's more effective for us to hire gifted generalists than these sort of functional hires, right? So we don't think in terms of, usually we don't think in terms of specialized skills like data scientist and then designer and then program manager or something. Usually our hiring is done from a much more general place where we're saying, trying to find those public entrepreneurs. Sometimes I call them hustlers, right? There's different connotations of that word. So, but I mean, these are people that we are essentially empowering to go and do whatever they think is right. And my job and my co-chair's job is to provide support and guidance when necessary, but it's really a question of unleashing these people into the organization and supporting them when they start knocking things over or they start rubbing people the wrong way. But we do very much hire for people with high EQ, right? So these are people that know how to read a room, that know how to infer the informal channels of control in a big institution like this. And our job is really just supporting them in being these public entrepreneurs.
That's great. That's pretty cool. So talk a little bit, Nigel, if you would, about the culture of the office, and then compare or contrast that to the other legacy city departments, and how does that culture interact? How do those cultures interact with each other?
So, we are very aware that we have a very fortunate position within local government, right? There's no doubt. So we always want to be respectful as a team to the other departments who were hired to do very different jobs, right? So usually when you look back over the public sector over the last 50 years or so, a lot of the job was really about maintaining fiscal responsibility with public dollars, right? And as a result, these have to be very serious-minded, responsible people. The challenge is that I don't think you get creativity out of those same people, right? They just weren't hired for that, right? They don't have necessarily the skills or the background to sort of brainstorm or be creative in that way. And so, when we are, one of the things that we don't want to do in positioning ourselves, we don't want to be the people that are trying to push change on other people, right? We don't want to be trying to, so sometimes, I hope this isn't insulting for anyone out there, but when I think about the models for getting things done inside of local government, I think about there's certainly more than two, but the two ways that we think about it are you can either be a consultant or you can be an entrepreneur, right? So consultants in local government are often people that are hired to do some kind of analytical piece of work, which amounts to a report that's written, right? And the challenge with that model is that once that report is written, it often just goes onto a shelf. Through no fault of the consultants, right? I mean, their job is to do that report, that analytical work. The problem is that it becomes shelfware. And so we've always tried to frame ourselves as internal entrepreneurs and not consultants, so that our job is to engage with these different departments, build up a sense of trust with them, right? Because we can only do our work if they trust that we won't hang them out to dry if things go south in some way. And then we always want to position ourselves as adding value, right? So these different departments, what you call legacy departments, they, nowadays in the 21st century, they have different needs than they once did, right? They want to do, research, either sort of qualitative research about how people like or don't like services, or quantitative research and so on. And they often need help in doing these things, right? Because they don't have those skills in-house often. And so that's a moment for us to step in and provide support, right? So we're not doing things to them, we're hopefully doing things with them. We very much make it our job to understand other people's business. We're sort of nosy that way, so that, we want to understand the issues that are top of mind for the policy team or for the housing department or whoever, so that when we can anticipate their needs and the kinds of potential collaborations that they want to explore. And so we're always thinking in terms of building trust with these other agencies and adding value, and not asking them to do things in response to what we're doing. We always want to be able to, like when we engage, we have a 3-step model to our work: explore, experiment, and evaluate, right? So as we explore, as it relates to the city government, we make it our business to try to understand their business, as I was saying. So we try to understand their issues and how they are trying to deliver against the mayor's vision. And then as we talk to these different departments, we're looking for testable experiments to explore how to improve or to create new services. And then, once we've done the experiment, kind of running it over whatever makes the most sense in terms of time and scale, then we go into the final phase, which is about understanding, did that thing work or did it not? If it didn't work, we try to shut it down, obviously, as quickly as we can. But if it does work, our job becomes one of helping them get to scale. So we're not just throwing these experiments over the wall, but we're helping them think through procurement and funding and training and union negotiations, whatever they need to be able to deliver. So we try to help them do all of that sort of work.
Okay, Nigel, in the interest of time, let's move forward a bit to ideation. And I remember almost 3 years ago, the city of Boston issued a smart cities RFI, right? And it was quite short, as I remember, and you had 150 plus responses. So how did that whole RFI idea evolve, and how did it tie into the strategic plan for the city, the 2030 plan? And kind of tell us about some of the responses, and what were some of the best and what were some of the worst ones? Because for your office, I'm guessing it's all about ideation and, like you say, bringing those to fruition if they're good and scale.
So I just mentioned our 3-step model: explore, experiment, and evaluate. So as we think about, like, what is the most effective way to explore, or what are some effective ways. We are routinely, like, we talk to startups pretty much every day. Someone always has a new idea, which is great, and they're approaching us with these new ideas. They want to talk about it, which is also great. And we realize, but I mean, it's still as many, although we're sort of still inundated by those kinds of organizations, and sometimes they're based on prior friendships or relationships, but we just wanted to open it up as broadly as we could. And so that was the point of the Smart Cities RFI. And in particular, we were looking for approaches to smart city technology and IoT and design that was in alignment with us, right? So one of the things, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're a very human-centered, focused team, right? So we want to understand a big part of the RFI in terms of the content and the language was really trying to introduce a sense of humanity and humanism into the way that these technologies operate in an urban environment. We want to understand how do they affect people's lives, and how do they make the city more livable. And so, interestingly, some of my favorite responses were those that essentially had that were less product oriented and more process oriented, right? Because in a lot of ways, the only real way to understand what the issues are in a community is to engage the community, which means a system of process. Even if you have a sense of the kinds of things that you want to deploy in that neighborhood. And so the ones that I didn't like were essentially like drop-in solutions, right? Where people were building things, kind of out of sight, out of mind, and then just showing up with a black box and saying, here, you guys should buy this. And with no real sense about how that black box device would actually impact people's lives. And so the only real way to know what that impact will be to do these experiments, which was the whole point of the RFI, was to sort of look for new potential partners to engage in more experiments and prototypes over the time.
Yeah, I think if anybody in the call is interested, we have the link to both the RFI and the responses. We'd be happy to send out. So send us an email and we'll distribute that. I often speak at conferences and am always free to give that because it's just a rich set of documents with some wonderful ideas. Nigel, as you know, we're quite blessed to be in the Metro Boston area. There's a lot of activity and a big ecosystem around clean technology and smart cities. But Boston is the gorilla in the Commonwealth, and there are many smaller and medium-sized cities that don't have the technical resources of a Boston or even a Pittsburgh or an Austin, Texas, right? So what approaches would you recommend for a smaller city that may not have as many resources? How do they kind of get started on this smart city path, and what are some of the means and methods they could use to do innovations like have been undertaken in Boston?
So I think like one of the first things to do is to take stock of the resources that you have available to you. My sense is, for example, local government doesn't do as effective a job as it could in connecting with higher ed, right? So like universities, colleges are a huge source of intellectual capital and obviously smart people. And I think that that's a huge and often missed opportunity for local, even for small cities and towns, right? Because a lot of small cities and towns have a university of some kind. And I think it doesn't have to be a big like tier 1 research university. Some of the most creative work that I'm proudest of over the years was done with a small liberal arts college here in Boston called Emerson College, just filled with creative people. And so that's one thing. And, beyond that, I'm essentially, finding ways to collaborate with other players in the environment, I think is the name of the game in a lot of ways. I think, the approach that we've taken, with a lot of like startups that approach us is to, rather than start out dictating terms and worrying about who owns the data and those kinds of things, which are all very important questions, obviously, but rather to establish a collaborative rapport, and so you can develop some shared values. And so, my sense is a lot of these companies, many of these companies, are in the business not only to make money, but to improve city living, right? They want to make cities better, more effective in one way or another. And so almost always, these companies want to engage with municipal or local government to explore, new business models or new technology and where they will be most effective. And so I think it's easy for local government to say collaboration, but I think that to do it effectively, it can be very hard. There's a wave right now of local government that's trying to collaborate with universities. There's a great NGO out there called the Metro Lab Network that's trying to highlight this work that's happening across the country, across the world, really. But highlighting these university local government partnerships and trying to develop some best practices from within that. So I think that's one resource in general. And a lot of the foundation, a lot of the money that's gone into this work has come from philanthropy. So I encourage local government also to develop relationships, and not only to go through with philanthropy, especially the big nationals. So Bloomberg Philanthropy, the Knight Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, all those biggies. And don't just approach it from a transactional perspective, right? I think that once the foundations get your mission, once there's a sense of rapport between, the city administrators and the philanthropy, they will often be far more creative in supporting the needs of the city than if you just approach them with a proposal that you wrote a couple of years ago.
Nigel,
that's really
Chris,
good. I
this
think
is
we're.
John. I hate to interrupt, but we're running short of time. So I did want to get a couple of questions from the audience in there, if that's okay.
Go for it. Yeah.
So we'll turn it back over to you. Thank you. Thank you again, Nigel.
Yes,
we'll see you around the hood.
Good chatting with you, Chris.
Bye.
Real briefly, maybe you can cover, just to give people an idea of the kinds of projects that you have worked on, maybe even some of the best and the worst, if there is such a thing, to give some idea of the scope.
I will do my best to be brief, but as you can detect, I'm not all that good at that. So some of my favorite projects were, I don't know if my favorite, but some of the projects that stick out in my mind are some of our earliest. And so I referred to Emerson College. So when we were starting New York Mechanics, there was a new group that was being started at Emerson called the Engagement Lab. And I went over there just to meet them, to see what they were up to. And they were interested in exploring the use of games, both digital and non-digital, to facilitate civic dialogue. And a big city like Boston has community meetings and public hearings pretty much every day. Some department is engaging some community somewhere, and we're basically doing that in exactly the same way that we were 400 years ago, right? They're these sort of town meeting kind of approaches, and I think that it's just played out as an approach, and people are tired with that model. And so some of my favorite early work was in working with the Engagement Lab to develop, digital games of one sort or another to facilitate dialogue about every conceivable topic that that's worthy talking about in an urban context. Everything from changes to the school system to developing a vision for the future of Boston and so on. So sort of digital games has always been a big interest. We were also the first city, more or less, to roll out a 311 app. Our original app was called Citizens Connect, and that was a very successful project for us. That I think certainly it was, the technology was an important piece of it, but I think it also changed the nature of the relationship between the public and the public sector, because I think that it raised expectations on both sides, which was good. And so I think it created an opening to begin to explore all kinds of new things. We're really interested in housing. We started a housing innovation lab a couple of years ago, where we're looking at new models for government to support more creative uses of housing. We're very into public health and so on. So lots of stuff.
Great. I know we're running a couple of minutes over, but I'd love to take a couple of more minutes to ask just a couple more questions. So hopefully we can squeeze a few more in.
Sure.
So the question here is about how is the office funded in terms of its budget? And kind of a related question, like specifically for your office, how do you prove the
Mhm.
value then? Are you measured on ROI, for instance?
Both good questions. So the team is funded through a pretty heterogeneous approach, right? So, for a long time we were heavily grant funded, but in terms of the project, like the project level funding has often been grant funded. Our salaries are paid by the city. Most of us are full-time city employees. The money comes from a combination of Bloomberg Philanthropies and Knight Foundation and MacArthur Foundation and so on. But increasingly what's happened is we're trying to move into a model where the city is interested in paying for more of what we do. And so at various points, we've developed more of we have our own capital budget and we have a small operating budget and so on. So, the total cost, it varies from year to year, honestly, and is drawn from all these different sources. So it's probably, altogether, there's between 8 and 12 of us on the team at any given moment in time. So all told, I would guess we're probably between $500,000 to $1 million in terms of total budget. That's across all these different sources of funding. In terms of how do we demonstrate value, very good question. A lot of it is about understanding what the mayor needs and wants, right? And so we have a big strategic plan that we developed over the last couple of years called Imagine Boston 2030. And so that plan, IB 2030, essentially is the marching orders for the city departments. And so we will often draw from that plan inspiration in terms of the kinds of things that we do and the way that we think about the value of what we're doing. So, for example, we do a lot of very human-centered approaches to supporting other departments. And so, if it's about changing the way driving happens in the city, we'll work with the transportation department to develop some complementary metrics about the way people are making transportation modal shifts and so on, and it kind of varies. So we try to align what we're doing very specifically with the needs of the department and with the mayor.
It's related to another question, actually, your comments there, but you talked before about sort of supporting the departments and what they had to their initiatives. But can you talk about also how much of your work is actually driving change and kind of forcing innovation down to the departments? Does it come from that plan? Do you do a lot of that kind of top-down work, or is it primarily driven from the departments to you to start a project?
So the projects come to us from pretty much every conceivable place, right? So some of them come to us from the public, some of them come to us from the mayor and the senior leadership within the city, and some of them come from like the people very much in the middle or even lower in the departments. And so, but we, as I said before, like we don't want to be forcing change on anybody. As much as we try to, if we see if there's a change in approach that's happening in a different department, we'll try to very quickly find the person that's behind that change and find a way to support them, and we'll do whatever is needed. So sometimes, as I was saying, like sometimes that means protecting that person from failure by essentially kind of offloading the risk from them to us. In which case, we'll give them all of the approbations that come, but we will absorb all of the failure that may or may not come. And so, the context for the work that we do are very much the Imagine Boston plan and the other sort of subsidiary plans. But the cultural stuff, we work primarily through culture, and so we make it our business to understand the culture in these different departments, to understand who are the change agents, what do they need to be successful, who are the people that are struggling but they don't have a way to deliver that we can support. And so we take a very supportive approach to driving innovation and supporting innovation. Yeah.
Interesting. So I'm going to squeeze in one more question. I'm actually going to combine a couple of questions.
Yep.
So can you comment on smart and responsive lighting? Do you imagine, or have you been involved in any kind of systems there? in particular, this person is asking if you imagine systems that are actively developing social cohesion. And the other part of that question, which I'll throw in there, is have you done anything in terms of natural gas technology to reduce carbon footprint? I know those are two totally different things, but if you could kind of comment on that.
I'm going to forget the second one, so you may have to remind me.
Okay.
I forget the first question now too. What's the
Sorry.
first question?
So smart
Yeah.
and connected lighting, do you think
Yes.
to actively develop social cohesion?
Right. So, one of the things that's always been very clear to us is that infrastructure affects safety, right? In all sorts of ways, right? And so certainly, we've done, sometimes it's not just a question of like whether we are doing it, but can we be supportive of someone else that's doing it? So the Public Works Department has always been a good collaborator to the police department in understanding, if a place is not well lit, it's a recipe for potentially for crime or kind of antisocial behavior in general. And so, when the city in general is interested in understanding how we can use infrastructure to support pro-social behavior. And so, that it cuts in lots of different ways, so we'll try to, one of the things that we'll do is we will go out of our way to conduct these experiments as much as we can in the open, so that people are clear about what we're trying to achieve. Sometimes we're more and sometimes we're less effective at doing that. But the idea is that we're moving to a model. We have an experimental approach that kind of came out of the RFI that Chris was talking about, called beta blocks, where the idea is to create these beta testing innovation blocks throughout the city, where we will be able to let the community collaborate with local government and with the vendors, whoever they may be, to explore the kinds of technologies that they want to see in their neighborhoods and how these will help or hurt social life. On the natural gas issue, we've been working very close. So the short answer, well, is sort of, we have a close working relationship with a lot of the universities in the area. And over the past 5 or 6 or more years, there have been some really good research that's been done at Boston University about at this specific issue. And so so that is less about us investing in that. And so where possible, we just have to be smart. It was one of the big resources we have access to in Boston are all these universities, Boston University and Northeastern and UMass Boston and all the private universities as well. And so wherever possible, we will leverage those institutions to help us explore new technologies and new approaches to driving value in the city.
Great. Well, I think you've provided a lot of excellent information for everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Nigel, and thank you, Chris.
My pleasure.
So I think we'll wrap up there. I just wanted to again thank the speakers, but also encourage everyone to join our next webinars that are coming up. We have speakers from different walks of life coming to talk about their expertise in developing smart cities. The next couple are shown on the screen here. So there's one on smart city economies in June with Nicola Vila from MasterCard, and another one which is sort of the utility side of things, how distribution companies can help create smart cities, with Scotty Hudo in July. So please join us for those sessions when they are available. You can register at our website on the link that's shown here. And again, thank you for attending, and thank you for our speakers once more. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.